It's Mary Rowe. I'm from the Canadian Urban Institute, and I'm so pleased to be participating with my esteemed colleagues here at this wonderful, extraordinary thing that Chris Fair has put together with many colleagues called World City. Here we are, coast to coast to coast to coast to coast. I don't know how many coasts there are, but there's more than 3, and multiple time zones to have a really, really expansive, but also focused, serious conversation about what is urban life like, as we've had 18 months of this extraordinary event called COVID and all the measures that have been taken to try to contain COVID, cope with COVID, and we are still completely enmeshed in this. And we just want to acknowledge that anybody that's watching who's in the middle of a 4th wave or a 5th wave, or you're in any kind of crisis around this, we are aware of this, that not everybody is at the same stage, and that we want to just acknowledge that this continues to be a life and death struggle in communities across the world. It's also, I happen to be, the Canadian Urban Institute, as I suggested, is a national entity. That's why Canada's in its name. But I happen to be in Toronto today, which is the traditional territory of a number of First Nations, which are the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It's also now it's home to many First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and we have an ongoing discussion about how we come to terms with the legacy of exclusion and the ways in which public spaces have, in Canada's case, they have been an extension of colonialism. And so they structurally actually were built decades and decades and decades ago to exclude certain kinds of populations. And we now continue to live with how that excludes not just Indigenous, but people of color, people who have different kinds of diversities that live in urban environments and choose to live in urban environments. And how do we now come to terms with the barriers that have been created by the way we build and manage cities, and then by the way we live in them and the way we resource them. And I'm sure my colleagues here are going to speak to this about how their practice and their perspective is all about shifting that to actually create places that are inclusive, that are welcoming, that are feel welcome to every kind of person, and that we always say at CUI that urbanism is for everyone. Nobody is the boss of the city. We all own the city. And the question is, how do we actually concretely do that? So I'm really pleased to have this title of the session be the nature of the relationship between when people and place actually come together. What's the extraordinary potential that unlocks, that here we are living in close proximity? What can we make happen? And specifically, how do we do inclusive placemaking? So Madeline, Charlotte, Charlotte, I didn't check. Is it Charlotte or Charlot? What do you prefer?
Charlotte's perfectly fine.
Charlotte, oh, listen to your lovely accent, Charlotte. I want to be able to, so musical the way you speak. And Kenneth and me, you 3 and me, to talk for 30 minutes on what you think inclusive placemaking is. So I'm going to start with you, Madeline, if I may. If you can just give the audience a sense of, first of all, where are you? And then what's the lens that you're bringing in this extraordinary moment in time that we're in as we emerge? Let's hope, touch wood, that we're emerging. What's the lens that you're bringing in your practice to how we actually make places inclusive?
My name is Madeline Spencer, and I am actually, I work in Santa Ana, California. Santa Ana is a community that is a majority community of Latino residents. 80% of the population is Latino from all different parts of Mexico. What I've been doing and what I've been learning, because I do believe that the community is the expert, is that number one, you just have to listen and understand. And when you speak automatically about design, to me, what I have learned is that design is a matter of experience. And what that means to me is that there is a pattern language in space that comes with cultural, traditional ideas of what space means. And so a lot of times people bring that with them from their home countries. And there are very, very real ways in which the configurations of space create a sense of comfort. And if you're in a Western city, being able to create adaptation and acclimate to different environments requires a sort of freedom that I think Western culture hasn't really embraced, even though it is an immigrant. There are many immigrants from all over the world. So that's something that I think that right now, and it's a really important time to start really talking about what it means to allow people to reconfigure space in ways that meet the values that are diverse.
Yeah. I love that notion of freedom, that really, how do we create enabling conditions for freedom to be able to participate? And I also appreciate, Madeline, the point you made about listening. I have on my fridge, talk less, listen more. We've had this extraordinary opportunity to watch in periods of crisis, how do people express what they need in their community. We've watched it during COVID. They've said we need more public space, we need more green space, we need more access to how can we safely engage. So important that we listen. And also that idea, as you suggest, that let's look at the patterns. Pattern language is this thing that designers have talked about because of a famous book that Christopher Alexander put together, but only people who are designers know what that is. I love what you're suggesting, which is that we all have the capacity to identify the patterns that are in front of us and what does that mean. So I appreciate everything you've just said. Charlotte, let's go to you next, and then Kenneth, we're going to round the corner with you.
Sure, thank you so much for having us. I'm Charlotte. I'm now calling in from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. But I'm the director of Placemaking Europe. So we're a network of about 4,000 people and 120 leaders across 30 different European countries. And I have the pleasure to represent that right now, let's say. And I think what I would like to bring to the table here today, because I can't agree more with what Madeline has said about listening. I do think that in the processes that I like to do in terms of placemaking, I really want to go into co-creation, because I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding of placemaking being, let's say, product placement or making a place look nice with a particular narrative and a particular sort of copy-paste kind of look and feel that you sometimes tend to see around the world, especially as we're scaling up placemaking. But I think what I'm really, really strong about is that all the processes that engage in placemaking need to be very, let's say, indigenous or very local, and really involve local people. So depending on the communities that you work in, the shape and size and scope of these placemaking projects change inherently according to the people who are at the table. And I think inclusive placemaking is absolutely not a given, because it takes a lot of effort to get a certain user groups at the table, especially, for example, here in the Netherlands, where I'm doing a lot of underground work. I think you tend to see that if you leave it to municipalities to invite people to public engagement processes, always the white middle-aged people show up at the community centers, but you really have to take an extra step and extra effort to reach out to different people in the community, and don't see it as a given that people come to join you in the process, but really actively reach out through creative tools and being out on the street, and always asking yourself who is missing at the table. If you know the demography of a different community, that you know that if certain community groups don't show up, that you need to pay an extra effort in having them engaged, co-design a space together. But even more particularly, let's go beyond co-design, but really talk about co-management and sort of the orgware that we see in communities, that ownership should be handed over to communities as much as we can.
It's interesting. It's interesting, as you say, not only does the place have to be welcoming, but the process that created the place has to be welcoming.
Exactly, because
all the way through.
Design follows. Yeah.
Yeah. You just put the fear of God in me when you said, oh, we're going to do product placement. Oh, tell me that isn't going to be the case. But I know what you mean, that as soon as something starts to be popular, then all of a sudden there are these corporate approaches, and here's what a good place looks like, and we all know that could be the recipe for disaster, because it tends to all look the same, and then all of a sudden it doesn't look like Santa Ana, or it doesn't look like Amsterdam. Or Kenneth, talk to us about your experience. What's the lens that you're bringing to your practice around inclusive placemaking?
Hello everyone, Kenneth Bailey. I'm one of the founders of Design Studio for Social Intervention. We're based in Boston, Massachusetts, but our work is often done in other parts of the United States. And we recently wrote a book that really talks about our conceptual framework around design, which also really shapes our thinking around creative placemaking, which is called Ideas, Arrangements, Effects. And you'll find a lot of similarity and a lot of solidarity with what you already were saying about configuration and rethinking cities. And the ideas is that ideas about the world aren't floating in space; they're actually instantiated in our everyday lives. They show up in the chairs we're sitting in. They show up in the spaces we occupy. They show up in the relationships between things and people and places. And if we want to change the world, we have to understand the relationships between things and people, and those relationships are the arrangements. And if we are interested in making the world a better place, we have to start at rearranging the world to produce, in our language, different effects. And so a lot of what we really do when we're doing creative placemaking is create a sketch, almost like a operating question. To give you an example, one of our projects we like to do is called Public Kitchen, where we pose the question: if kitchens were public like schools or libraries, how would they change social life? And then you put enough of scaffolding together for communities to come together, answer that question, but start to rehearse that way of being together in this fiction called a public kitchen, this productive fiction, this social fiction, such that they actually start to say, wow, we could make this true. Another one we like to do is called dance court. In the United States and in a lot of urban areas, we're used to having basketball and tennis courts, but there aren't places to come together to collectively dance. At least not with the infrastructure that affords that. And so we're really interested in having these little sketches that people can take up and rehearse, and then start to reconfigure their own relationships to each other, themselves, and start to imagine new ways to make public life.
Just have to find the unmute button. I love the language you guys are using, like the public kitchen, the dance court. These are wonderful phrases, just that convey all sorts of things. This is where during the pandemic, I feel like we all turned into the DIY city, basically, like, well, what can we do with that space? Let's try it. And somehow we gave ourselves permission, or maybe it was just that we were all in this crisis situation, and so we're going to find a way to express ourselves differently. Do you have a sense of whether now that we're emerging, that we can take the lessons of the last several months and somehow make them more regular? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just not something we did in a crisis.
I worry that a lot of the lessons that and all of the experimentation around public life that happened during COVID will more affect upper class and middle class communities, because so much of it was about rethinking commercial life. And I want there to be more space to bring that same level of, to use Madeline language, reconfiguration to all forms of public life, and to see those kinds of questions asked to scale. How do we continue to push the conversation out horizontally, so it's not about making streets and spaces that really bolster just businesses and their capacity to make seating more available to something that is much more more robust sense of how do we make public life better for everyone.
Yeah, it's really and public life, it's not all commercial, it's not all about transactions. It's not, but and I mean, I know what you mean. I love the patios, and I hope these patios, I live in a cold climate, and I hope these patios last. But I appreciate what you're suggesting, that it's got to be about more than just, like, what if you don't have the cash to sit down and have a beverage? Then how do those spaces work for you? And also, what about the parts of our cities that didn't have enough commercial vitality anyway, or didn't have the amenities? Madeline, in the neighborhoods that you're working in, I'm assuming that you're working in places where there wasn't always enough infrastructure. Go ahead.
So I think that there's an interesting moment of sort of convergence where exactly what Kenneth is describing, and where kind of this idea of commercial spaces having the ability to create these flex zones that allowed for the pop out of the restaurants to occur. We had been fighting for that in our downtown for about 7 years, and then it was able to occur from pilot to complete inception where they got funding to put them in. But at the very same time that the Black Lives Matter, I mean, after George Floyd's death, and there was this moment where it was the stark contrast of people sitting in these patios and marches happening on these streets. And someone, and I cannot remember her name, and I was trying to recall, but she said, this is a new form of purple lining, because what was occurring at the exact same time and what people were seeing is that in our neighborhoods, we have a city that's impacted, meaning multiple families, communitarian Latino families are living in very small quarters, maybe a few families at once, and they can't go into the local park. They can't play on the streets. They're all stuck. And domestic abuse is one of the highest forms of violence going on in our community. And kids were not in school. So you just look at that situation and you're like, why isn't the flexibility that's happening in a downtown happening where these folks are able to like shut down their street and turn it into a play yard so that all of the youth can come out? And later in the pandemic, you did start to see in maybe more suburban neighborhoods where a garage becomes the place where everybody's showing the movie and everybody from the community is gathered around. But I forgot to say at the very beginning, I'm a part of the placemaking leadership team in the United States, which is a network. And we actually developed a program right when we started to see this contrast occurring called the United Streets of America. And our very first area that we decided to work with was this Cambodian community center that needed to create a marklet to get goods to the local elders in the community. They needed food and they needed a place to come. So we extended and asked for the same thing that it had in a commercial zone in a nonprofit center so that they could create the pop out and also have a form of transportation to take food to local neighborhoods. So this became a thing where we now have been to 60 cities in the United States looking at what placemakers are doing to help impact communities at the ground level. So I just want to leave it with that because this is a very serious, telling thing.
I mean, I am a little worried, and Charlotte said it when she said about, whether it's going to get corporatized. I'm a little worried too that placemaking sort of gets seen as this sort of, thing that's only for certain kinds of neighborhoods and not for other kinds of neighborhoods. And we saw that, for instance, people that were focused on bike lanes, and you had other communities that really, the last thing they were thinking about was bike lanes. They actually just needed safe spaces where they could actually, as you suggest, get out from a situation where they were where there were multiple families and you got children who are trying to get their homework done, and and they're in corridors and things. So we have a colleague here in Toronto, Jay Pitter, who's an author and a placemaker, and she coined this term forgotten densities, that you've got many communities across the world where the density is not equitable. There aren't equitable amenities around it. And so can we correct that? I guess that's part of what I was getting at when I said we've got so much we have to fix that was exclusionary historically, right? So Charlotte, when you talk about co-design and co-management, and you hear what Madeline's talking about, it's got to, and what Kenneth actually started us on, it's got to be about engaging folks that aren't the usual suspects in this kind of work, so that we all have a sense of, you said at the very beginning, Madeline, ownership, that we all have to have a sense of ownership. How do we do that? How do we engage people to make sure that they feel they do have ownership?
Yeah, very relevant questions, and I think we're all like in the sort of after days of the pandemic in some parts of the world, but as you were saying, Mary, in some parts of the world it's still raging, of course, as at the moment. But we're all trying to learn our lessons from it. So I think as Placemaking Europe early October, we collaborated with the city of Barcelona on a platform called the After COVID City, sort of trying to reflect and look beyond the COVID pandemic to what cities have learned from the pandemic. So I think one of the things that we try to do, at least, is try to advocate at the citywide level for these different lessons that we've learned. So you do see indeed these temporary attempts that we've seen across Europe, but across the globe, with bike lanes being implemented, with the super blocks in Barcelona, which are actually community streets. So they're not focused on commercial.
But do you think? But do you guys think that we can move this from being temporary to somehow? I mean, you're talking about flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
Can we be nimble and flexible when we're out of this crisis? I mean, what are the signs you're seeing, Madeline and Ken, in your communities? Are you seeing a kind of openness to what Charlotte's calling for? This is my unbidden friend here who wants to join the conversation.
Go for it, Madeline, then I'll jump in.
I was just going to say, the work that really needs to be done, I think, with the municipalities, because while one of the things that we saw is that something could go from pilot to inception in 1 year's time because of this flexibility, that needs to happen at all times. There needs to be the ability to pilot and transition into these changes in space. It has to be more available to everyone, and it has to be something that is a regular practice, not something that just happens because of a pandemic.
Or takes years, you know. We just had years of excuses, and that's what suddenly they're able to do it. What do you think, Ken?
I think it would be an interesting provocation for leaders in placemaking to help us make this point, that we need to insist upon an equitable sort of experimental equity, in a sense.
What about just equity? You know,
equity.
Yeah. What about just getting rid, like looking at the books and saying, what are the rules we've got that are preventing people from being creative and doing their thing? Can we move some of the rules off? And then the question would be, how do we get resources into communities that don't have the kind of commercial activity, or that will take intention, don't you think?
It'll take intention. It will take some regulatory policy changes, but I also think it takes leadership.
Yeah.
And so I hadn't thought about it until we were on this call right here, but I think it could be something we could call for collectively as a global placemaking community, is like this kind of a call for experimental equity, tactical equity, or some sort of equity.
Tactical, let's do that. Let's take back tactical urbanism.
Totally.
And put equity into that frame.
Absolutely.
Because I think we've proven that a pop-up park can work. You know what I mean? I don't think we need to say that. I don't think anybody needs convincing on that. I think we've won on patios. We've won on, umbrellas. Now we got to do the tough stuff. We've got to do
exactly.
We got to do the tough stuff that bridges. Yeah, go ahead.
And to make room for co-designing what a friend of mine, Caesar McDowell, would refer to as co-designing on the margins, or co-designing with the margins. This sort of co-design that doesn't that's beyond sort of a co-design for businesses and economy, but a co-design that's about civil society, that's about social life, that's about equity. The term economy is actually about a lot more than money. But for some reason, it's become something we just think it's only about money. But when you actually look at there is a human economy. It's how things fit together. We need to take that word back. I don't quite know how to do it. But going back to what Charlotte was challenging us to think about, you're part of a national network, Charlotte. Madeline, you were saying you're part of a national network too, the US thing, eh? Do you find those kinds of collaboration forums helpful to advance a practice? Do you think that, and Ken just said, hey, let's call for a sort of global movement. Do you think those are valuable? How do you anticipate we could use that? Madeline, you first. What do you think?
the truth is that when it's almost like the old guild system.
Yeah.
When there's a group of people that all are like, okay, we are all practicing this. And when you see across like 60 different cities, the different ways and interventions that people are doing with placemaking, it's really fascinating. And to recognize ourselves as a cohort amongst other different kinds of guild systems, essentially, it really does help us to be able to move the needle. So I absolutely think it does, because it's a network is a network. You're able to disseminate information, tools.
Yeah.
We do tool tests regularly. There's all these different things that people collectively can work on. And I just wanted to mention that, Kenneth, you sent a really great article to us prior to this about space configuration. And I thought it was very telling also in terms of this, but we can talk about that in a minute.
Well, we should share that. We'll make sure the World City people put that up in the resource page when this session's being broadcast, so people can look at the article that Ken sent through. This idea of tools, and also I love the notion of guilds. Although I've got to say that it always felt to me like I would never be able to be a member of a guild. It always felt too special. You know what I mean? But you're saying somehow this would be kind of an inclusive thing. Charlotte, is it possible? Can you have a membership? You know, Woody Allen's thing, I wouldn't want to be part of a club that included me or accepted me. Like, are we able to create a club, a notion of affinity, which is what Madeline's getting at? And can we do that in an inclusive way? Or does it end up feeling elite?
I think so, but with intention, like it was already mentioned.
With intention, back to intention.
Very intentional about who you invite as part of your network. And I do think that lots of us within the Placemaking X Global community and the different regional networks. So of course, Madeline represents Placemaking US, I represent Placemaking Europe, and there's about 14 regional networks now across the globe. I do think that most of them are intentional about being inclusive, but still it requires a whole lot of work. Also looking at the configuration of your own team and the configuration of who's offered a seat at the table. But I do think that, like what Madeline was saying, Kenneth's article, it's a brilliant write-up. Sharing these stories and advocating together for these different kinds of working does really help. Like 2 years ago, we were able to produce this book called Our City, Countering Exclusion in Public Space, that sums up about 50 tools for equitable placemaking, but also tapping into the financial mechanisms, for example, like going from gentrification to gentilification, because sometimes neighborhoods do need improvement, but maybe in a more gentle way than mechanisms that push people out of their original residencies. So there is a way of like sharing, exchanging tools, advocating together, setting up global movements, and really trying to make an impact on a citywide scale, like we're trying to do, working directly with cities, and also working directly with, for example, the good real estate developers who are open to different ways of building community. So countering these mechanisms into systems change is definitely something you can do better with a global movement and with a big network than doing it all by yourself in your own city, I think. Sharing those lessons.
Ken, what do you think?
I was also thinking with these global networks, we'd also be able to be in solidarity with other strategies of placemaking that get marginalized or thought of as other. So a concrete example would be what's going on in LA with a shutting down of a lot of Latino Mexican street vendors. That's placemaking. However, it's placekeeping. However, it can be carved off and talked about in a bubble and not accepted and embraced by our global movement, and therefore it's fighting on its own. If those people had our global network behind them, we have to figure out how to do this globally and to tie these communities together and to say, in fact, what they're doing is urbanism, and what they're doing is teaching us how to organize from here up versus how to organize from the generic down. And I think there's a really fun, interesting. Look, it could be fun. It could be interesting. It could be impactful and really impact all the quality of our lives around the world.
You know, I really relate to what you're all three of you were saying around ground up activity, you know, comes organically from the ground, and how much we can learn from informality. It doesn't all have to be organized and applied from down, you know, from top down. It can actually come up, and we see that in different parts of the world. And we're seeing it in North America through the pandemic, where we're seeing people who are in situations where they're choosing to live in parks, or they're finding themselves unable to find shelter. And so here in Canada, they're called encampments. And I've been asking that question about, well, what can this teach us about the way in which people are wanting to make their lives work? And if a tent in a park feels like the way they, you know, but we tend to want to close those things down and shut those things off, and that it's a system failure. And I'm concerned. I appreciate there are issues of equity and justice and human rights and safety, but I also ask myself, well, is there something we can learn about that expression that we can see in front of our eyes, that people are in essence expressing a desire to live in a certain kind of way, the same way food trucks that suddenly sort of congregate in a certain, they're expressing a desire to experience life that way. And I'm wondering, as placemakers, are there ways for you folks to make authorities more comfortable with using space and places differently? Madeline, I bet you've had to confront this a gazillion times.
The interesting thing about what you just described is it seems like private organizations will actually even co-opt those things, and you'll go to Disneyland and have vendors of every style and nobody's left out. You can get you can get all different levels, but you go to a downtown and the food truck isn't allowed to be there because there's this scarcity idea that somehow if somebody at a different level wants to, like, the perfect example to me is if a whole Latino family comes downtown and they can afford to buy everyone corn from a vendor that's there, which I don't know if you've tasted, it's delicious, the corn that they have, but from a vendor, they can buy their whole family something, and the
Yeah.
father, mother, they can feel happy that their whole family got provided for, had a great experience in this space. They don't want to necessarily or cannot afford to go to a restaurant and pay however much that is, but they can have a satisfying experience. But you take away the person who vends the corn, and now you have an experience where they're no longer, it's not comfortable to be there anymore because they can't provide for their whole family in that space. And the thing is, it's understood to bring in all these different levels in an ecosystem that's a living ecosystem, and all these kind of triangulations of relationships. And folks don't recognize that when you destroy that, what you're actually destroying is you're controlling space, and you're controlling who can be there and who cannot, and what can be sold there and what cannot.
And every little bit, every little turn and corner is important in that ecosystem, right?
Right.
And we want to strengthen and enable more of that kind of mesh of ecosystem.
Well, those mechanisms are natural.
Yeah.
People know naturally how to do them. It's that we have powers that shut down that natural living system.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that we're constantly having to try to obstruct the shutdown. So anyway,
we've got to
and if we can connect across, because we're saying literally the same thing, Madeline. It's like we're saying the same sentences. And so if we're saying the same sentences and you're saying the same sentences, Charlotte and Mary, what does it mean if we do it collectively?
Yeah.
Is my question.
And so we have to kind of round up because they're going to pull the hook on us and say thanks very much. If you were to sort of pick a priority in terms of trying to advance everyone approaching this in an inclusive way and creating this global movement of inclusive placemaking, is there one thing that you would encourage people listening to focus on in let's say the next 6 months, Charlotte? One thing.
Oh my God, I'm first. I think further professionalize the field. So what we're trying to do, what all the other networks are trying to do by sharing tools, we need to do better.
Build our own capacity.
Build our own capacity and professionalize the placemaking fields to actually be taking into account equity and inclusion, I would say.
But not professionalize in a way that's going to push people out. Somehow it builds our practice. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what I mean with professionalization.
Yeah. I get it. One thing from you, Ken, what would it be? One thing that you'd have people focus on?
I think to open up more opportunities for communities of color to experiment now. And to start and to figure out a way to do it that's safe with COVID, but so that we can really start to have a practice of what spatial justice and looks and feels like in our bodies that we can share. And so I think
and actually get some examples so people can see, because as we know, people learn like crazy when they see, like, just even the way you guys have been speaking, everybody's going to come away with some kind of, oh, I never thought of it that way. Oh, that's how they're doing it there. Yeah. Okay, so creating situations where communities of color can start to try some stuff, have some resources, and let's just get out on the street. Yeah. Last word to you, Madeline. Is there one thing that you would say for the next 6 months people could double down and focus on?
Well, coming from a background of protest, I am in a mode where the creative act, which might be disruptive and even is to say yes, to find the adjacent possible and start living out the vision of that new space, which is something that Kenneth and them are practicing. They're actually doing that. And we need to be able to say yes to things. We need to say yes to piloting. We need to say yes to disrupting things that are normal. So my thing is saying yes for once, and it's not about saying no. It's about figuring out what is possible and how we can start constructing the possible and live in it.
Yeah, well, what a great way to finish this session on the art of inclusive. Anybody listening will agree that you are unbelievably creative, the three of you, in practicing the art of inclusive placemaking. And we've had this global pause that's made this topic all the more prescient for all of us. And so we're not going to squander the opportunity. We're going to get out there. We're going to look at what's possible. We're going to professionalize the practice. And we're just going to get resources and support, particularly into communities of color, to just get out and get on the streets and try some stuff. So on that optimistic note, thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your approach and your perspective and your values, which we heard really strongly about how we do the art of inclusive placemaking. And thanks again to World City for giving us a chance. And I always say in these conversations that this isn't the end. This has to just be the beginning, because apparently, according to Ken, we're starting a global movement. So we're all in it together. So I look forward to our next installment together. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Charlotte and Kenneth.